So Chris, you used the phrase positive stories a lot during the talk, but I was a little bit unclear on what exactly you mean by that. Could you elaborate?
Sure. So, for example, we've got a couple of units that we're able to say, hey, so by the way, we improved our environmental performance and we grew business at the same time. That's a very positive story. So usually you have this kind of negative relationship where, oh hey, we improved our environmental performance, but that's because we did less business, right? So because we did less stuff, we had less environmental bad stuff happening. In these couple of units, we said, hey, we had more guests coming through the doors. We had more students, more faculty, more whomever coming through the door. And oh, by the way, we were able to half our environmental impact, right? So that's a really compelling, positive story of you're able to decouple those relationships and do something that makes business sense and is really great for the environment and for the planet, right? The story about Green Mountain, where you have students who are applying what they've learned, like some faculty member taught them about some stuff. Great, the ideas are nice, but now I can actually really apply it, right? So if I'm a learner where I need to get hands-on, I need to get a little bit tactile with it, this food service provider just gave me an opportunity to actually really learn what it is that I want to learn and get credit for doing it, right? So it's those types of positive stories where you can really make some type of tangible difference and do it in a way that really supports what the institution is all about, what's really kind of their mission, right? Does that help answer the question?
Hi, so I was wondering, you mentioned that your online services provides metrics for evaluating their performance across all those different metrics. And I was wondering if you're also using business information, like in terms of, you mentioned that they're practicable on a business level and that they're actually improving their business. So I was wondering if you're using metrics for that as well, or if you're simply measuring environmentally.
Yes. This is a short answer. So the version 1.0, the tool itself, version 1.0 of the tool itself is measuring, all right, what's our carbon, water, waste impact. We've lined it up in such a way that we can take that data and pair it up with the rest of the business metrics to say, okay, well, what was your spend, right? What was your guest participation, right? What were all these other different relevant KPIs or key performance indicators, so that the tool gives you additional new insights. You don't need to duplicate systems that already exist, that we already have insights for. Pulling those together in some way that is new, that says, again, putting things into context, hey, so your environmental performance improved, what happened with the rest of the business? How did that change, right? So you can get those types of insights that have a lot more context built into them and have a lot more managerial actionability around them. Does that answer the question for you?
Yeah, thank you.
Another question. Sorry, I'll go next.
Hi. So you said at Green Mountain College, the students were able to access the data. What exactly did they do with that data? What projects were implemented?
Sure. So they've already had. Most concise way to tell the story. So Compass has already done a variety of life cycle analyses on different product items, right? So different line items within stuff that we bring in the back door. We've already mapped out a lot of the environmental impact for the biggest items, right? The ones that we see come in most frequently. There's still a lot of other items out there. And so we said, all right, hey, well, we have this inventory of everything that Green Mountain College is buying, right? All of that whole inventory, here's the portion that we have LCA data on. So students, take a look at some of these items, right? Here's some maybe of the next low-hanging fruit that are very specific to Green Mountain College and to your locality, and use those life cycle analysis frameworks, approaches, methodologies that your faculty member taught you about, apply that to this data set, and figure out what the farm to plate footprint is so that it lines up with the rest of the data, with the rest of the footprinting data. That.
Then once the data's there, like, what's the next step? Sort of changing their buying habits?
Yep, so once they came up with the insights, then they said, okay, great. Now we know this is the footprint of this mushroom dish or that dish or whatever. Now how do we impact behavior, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all based on the chefs are menuing for what the demographic is demanding, right? So now that you know that about this mushroom dish, communicate it in a way that is effectively engaging those students or that demographic to share that information out and say, hey, by the way, did you know that this dish is really flavorful, really tasty, really whatever is going to make the connection, and has X fraction of the environmental footprint of this dish, right? And helping shift behaviors that way through information, through engaging types of guest collateral and guest campaigns. So they took, step one was, hey, let's use the data, apply the frameworks to it that we have from our faculty. Now that we have those insights, come up with those engaging guest campaigns. And then on the back end, our guy on the ground, David, the food service operator there, was able to say, okay, great, we saw these. Now let's start doing some analysis on, we had this campaign, how did that change menuing, right? How did that change buying behavior? Did it? Did it not? Right? Those are the types of conversations that we're able to follow up and have with those stakeholders.
So it's going more from the demand side than the supply side of change?
I heard your question. I'm not necessarily sure I understood what you meant.
So, because they're marketing the demand, they're marketing toward the consumers, they're not seeing the data and then changing what's supplied to.
You want me to address that?
Yeah, go for it. I'm still not understanding the question. So,
Hi, I'm Kevin Blaney, and I'm the corporate chef for Charles here in New England. And David and Cindy, and a number of our campuses, to your point, it's about driving menu fatigue, menu variety. To Chris's data, we recognize that beef and or cheese are the two major contributors to carbon emissions or carbon footprint. So we know we will never get rid of beef on a menu. We know we will never get rid of cheese on a menu, but we can apply menu engineering to, if I have to have a hamburger on the grill station every day, my idea would be to menu something next to that hamburger that has a high satisfaction component to it. Maybe it's a Vietnamese banh mi sandwich using pork. The hamburger stays on the menu, but I serve 40% less hamburgers that day. So what I've done is reduce my beef consumption for the day and increase satisfaction through menu engineering. So the students kind of help us drive the menu, and we help promote variety. And variety on any college campus, you're going to hit a wall, and it's called menu fatigue. No matter where, you all experience it. You just get tired of going to the same places, eating the same cycle of items. But with the students' help, we can identify menu items that don't have as much cheese in it, not without cheese, less cheese. But we're not advocating that you'll never get cheese or you'll never get beef again. What we need to do as professionals is create a menu that has high satisfaction and then kind of a stealth approach to carbon reduction. Everybody wins. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
thank you.
So you skipped over the landfill component at the end. I'm just wondering to what extent
Sorry, this has kind of been on and off all day. To what extent the tool incorporates the waste component, how it's managed at the end of life? Does it account for composting? Does it account for food donation? Just wondering to what extent it captures that in terms of the carbon impact as well as methane.
Sure. So, it does capture a variety of the items that you just mentioned, right? So when you're looking at it from a waste perspective, right? What's my waste footprint? Looking at saying, all right, hey, if this is all the stuff that I'm bringing in the door, where does it go? How much of it goes to recycling? How much of it goes to composting? How much of it goes to food donations? How much of it goes to whatever other type of repurposing? And then at the end of the day, how much left is being landfilled, right? So we are tracking that aspect of it to see, to help a lot of units who don't have those types of metrics on hand from their colleagues in their waste haulers or whatnot who don't get those types of analytics or insights to help put that together in a way that they can communicate that really clearly and easily to their client, to the university in this case, right? To your point about, okay, so what about the methane, right? And what about all the rest of that stuff? And talked about, you know, how much of a big bad portion of greenhouse gas emissions methane is. When we looked at the life cycle analyses pieces, the largest demand was for farm to table. And so that's where we started with the life cycle analysis piece. When we are looking farm to
What do you
table.
mean for largest demand?
When clients are looking, say, for like for a carbon disclosure project or anything else like that, say like, okay, hey, where we need data on the stuff that you're providing. They were looking for cradle to gate, so in the university context, farm to table. That said, we are still seeing increasing demand for, okay, well, what happens from table to cradle, right? So that other piece about where does it go after that, and we are already starting to build that into the next iteration of the system. So it was higher hanging, smaller fruit than a lot of the other pieces, and even still, if we incorporated that, all of our signs and all of our indicators are saying your targets wouldn't shift that much. You'd still be focusing on beef. You'd still be focusing on cheese. You'd still be focusing on site equipment. You'd have a little bit more rich data to talk to, but it wasn't as big of a win immediately. Does that answer the question for you?
Yep, thank you.
Chris, I have a question related to how the information gets entered into the tool. Here at UVM, we use the Real Food Calculator to track 4 metrics about sustainability and ethics in the food system. And what that entails is having some students manually enter invoice data in order to capture that. And it's very time intensive, and we've been able to reduce the amount of work a bit, but I'm just wondering, how does the data get into your system? Who's doing that work? What type of like time commitment does that make? And how are you seeing that work over time?
Sure. Happy to talk on that piece. First, are in the audience today, are any of the students the ones who have been doing the manual labor to do that kind of coding? My apologies. Ouch. Harsh job to have. So yes, and that was one of the pieces that we designed for initially when we thought about, all right, hey, at the end of the day, this is ultimately something that has to drive and deliver value to our clients, right? It has to be something that for the universities, it demonstrates that we're living up to our commitment on the president's climate commitment and any of these other things with ASHE. It also had to be something that our operators could implement. It had to be something that was operationally feasible. And at the end of the day, our operators are food service professionals. They're out there getting the food out into everybody's hot little hands. So we wanted to do things that would be as light to non-existent touch as possible. So when you look at the ways that we're collecting data, the vast majority of the time we're just mapping existing data that we're already sitting on and mapping that over to the algorithms and to the lifecycle analyses that we were able to put together from our suppliers and say, all right, based on these invoices, here's that portion of the footprint, right? So A, that avoids all the manual labor and time and effort around that, and B, it avoids all of the human error that might come with that, right? So just map it easy, it's not even a click of the button, it's just back in the system to system. So on the food supply chain piece, does that answer the question for you? Yeah.
So I do a fair amount of life cycle analysis also, mostly energy, but a little bit of carbon accounting. And when I saw you talk about the where the biggest energy demand was and say that it was production, I was a little bit surprised because a lot of the data that I've seen shows the agricultural level being not a tiny part, but a minority of part, with the processing and packaging being bigger, and then the distribution and food service chunk being much bigger still. So I'm curious if you could explain that. You know, how do you figure that the production side is the biggest?
Sure. Also, Eric, right?
Yes.
Okay. Also, happy to follow up in addition to this, because I'm sure that there's loads of levels of detail that we can get into in the question. I saw your presentation from the last seminar. Alex was able to share that with me, so wanted to, while I was on campus, just compare notes with you. I'm sure that we can have more in-depth conversations and compare notes on that, but not to bore everybody else. To the brief point on that one, a lot of it comes from, when we talk about production, it's how is the thing made, and what is it that we're talking about being made, right? So the aspects around beef, for example, right? So we know that, hey, just from ruminants, from methane, from everything else like that, like cattle, beef, it's a really big portion of where emissions come from. And so for us in our bucketing of things, we bucket that as part of production, right? And so that's where a lot of that big hanging 80+% of the footprint comes from. It's just like, oh, hey, so a lot of it's coming from decisions around using beef or cheese or whatnot. The secondary add-on to that is, okay, well then you have to move the products. Whatever the products were, you have to move them, and then you have to process them, and you, et cetera, et cetera. But it's which products are you talking about in the first place? That was where we were seeing the biggest impact coming from. Does that answer the question for you? Again, at like the 30,000 foot level before we exchange data sets and start chatting in more depth?
Yeah. I have another question too, if I can, real quick.
Do you want to hold it? Sure.
I guess this is building a little on what Allison was saying earlier. We've been using the real food calculator here, which is really based on like food procurement and targeting changes in that realm. So I think one of the really interesting things of what you've presented with your tool is the ability to look at water and carbon and these other things that we don't touch on at all. So I didn't know if you could expand a little on what type of metrics you do look at to measure and make changes in those areas, you know, beyond like a food procurement. Are you looking at machinery? Are you looking at, you know, electricity usage? How are you measuring and making changes in those areas?
So if I heard the question correctly, it's what are we measuring? And what are we measuring in a way that will ultimately make a difference, right? That drives change. Did I get that? Okay. Short version, it depends. What's important to you, right? And so for some campuses, they're really focused on, hey, so tell me the BTU per guest, right? Others are, hey, so tell me the gallons per guest. Others are, I really want to know the pounds of CO2e per guest, right? Or I want to know the absolute footprint, I need to know that that's going down. Whatever those metrics are, having those conversations with the clients, with the campuses to say what's important to you, and really looking at, again, for example, with the President's climate commitment, right? So we want to get to 0, right? So that's an absolute target. We can be super efficient, but if our footprint went up on the absolute side, that's not as helpful. So being able to report in an absolute metric, right? Kind of going around in a circle, but I don't know if I'm actually addressing.
So it sounds like you tailor what you target in your metrics depending on what they're most focused on reducing, but
Rather than throwing like,
shapes.
yeah, rather than throwing like 30,000 different metrics at somebody, say like, all right, hey, you said these 2 things are the most important. Great. In the quarterly review, in the monthly review, in the semi-annual, the annual, whenever. These are the metrics that we'll have a conversation with you about, right? These are the ones that we're going to follow up on, rather than these miscellaneous, erroneous ones.
So I guess my other question, you know, you brought up the beef and the cheese, and the enteric fermentation and the methane emissions. I wonder, and maybe this is a question that we'll talk about some other time, but I wonder if your tool has a way of differentiating, you know, different ways of producing beef. Like you have your conventional feedlot, you know, largely grain-fed beef that's all fatty and marbled and is just an environmental disaster, versus, you know, a really well-run grazing operation which can actually build soil very fast and maybe, you know, sequester more carbon over the course of the year than you release as methane. You know, can you differentiate in your tool between different ways of producing the same, not really the same end product, but on paper it might look like the same end product?
Short version, yes. So based on, for example, folks down at Green Mountain or the folks over at, you know, Missouri State, Say, okay, hey, this was what we ordered, right? This was our inventory, this was our spend for the month, right? And we already mapped out with, again, the bulk of our vendors, our suppliers, using that 80-20 rule. Say, all right, these are the ones that we already have mapping for, and most of the beef got covered in that, so that particular shipment of beef came from this vendor for this geography, for this zip code. They actually sourced that from this farm, which has these practices, which et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very much about the actual footprint of that SKU, that product line going to that unit, versus just some aggregated kind of national mush of data. So it is very, very tailored to say, hey, ordering this one versus this one would make a difference.
More questions?
What do you do every day?
Happy to answer that. Can you unpack it a little bit and give me a little bit more context? Is it just like the overbubbling exuberance? You wonder how I find the energy? Are you looking like career path question? Help me understand the question behind the question.
A little bit more of a career path question. I make a point to ask this whenever I go to any kind of seminar on campus. I just want to know, you get to work in the morning, or maybe you don't go into an office, maybe you do everything from home. What does your day at work look like?
Sure. So, in the role that I have with Compass Group, for me, I'm on retainer. I'm a consultant that is helping and advising and engaging with Compass Group on this program. And I office in the U.S., right? So I can be wherever. There happen to be a whole lot of business in the Northeast where they said, hey, there's a lot of accounts out here. It would be great if you could be located there just so that you're local, it's easy. We don't have to fly you across the country. I have a lot of family out here. I get to experience things like Katrina, Sandy, firsthand. So lots of reasons why the East Coast were interesting for me, but I could be located anywhere. Because a lot of what I do on a daily basis or a weekly basis is a lot of phone calls or a lot of webinars with folks coast to coast, right? So whether that's folks up in Maine or in New Jersey or over in California, talking about what's going on with your campus. How, even though we've dialed it down and made it as light touch, zero touch as possible for operators, how do we help you get going on it, right? And once you have your data, how do you find your managerial insights? How do you build up that muscle to make sense of this and get going on it? Then once you have that, how do you tell your stories? How can I help you on that part? So it really depends on what the project is at that time, right? So what the demands, what the requests are. But it leaves a lot of flexibility for you to structure your day. And it's very rewarding in that regard to say, like, all right, hey, I know I need to get this stuff done, and sometimes that can lead to long hours, but at the end of the day, you know that it's actually going to stuff that is really getting used. It's not shelfware. So that is incredibly rewarding. That help address the career question for you? Okay.
This could be a question for either of you. Just going back to the menu idea, when we think about procurement and shifting procurement on the campus as a way to kind of get at the environmental impact of food, we run into the whole, like, do we actually need burgers every day, all day question? And I'm curious if Compass has done any, or Charwell's more specifically, has done any research on whether having beef on the menu at all times or cheese, whether that's like data driven or if it's just the response and the purchasing patterns that drives that.
Okay, there's a couple of ways to answer it because you can look at it the opposite way. If I serve steak and lobster every day, every meal, by day 7, you'd have pitchforks and torches outside of my office. So menu fatigue goes both ways. It could be, I'm sick of eating all of this prime rib beef. We looked at opportunities to menu distinctively to each campus based on demographics, athletics, male-female ratios, international students. There's a lot that goes into the design and development of any menu. So we have many places where we don't serve burgers every day at the grill. We have a grill, and if somebody absolutely wants a burger and they're willing to wait, we'll go back and get one and make it. But today on the grill, we're not doing that. We're doing quesadillas. Oh, bad example because that has cheese in it. But we would not menu that because that only contributes to menu fatigue. Students have a habit of walking into the same dining hall. They know what's already on that station because they saw it yesterday and the day before, so they keep walking. They know what's on that station because it's the same every day, whether it's pizza or pasta. So the idea in our strategies is that might have a grill on that station, but it's not called the grill. We might have something totally different over there, and it might be only 1 or 2 features, rather than having 7 or 8 features every day. So the boredom of menuing is a fact of life on a college university. So we don't commit to serving a burger every day, or cheese pizzas every day, or we don't put cheese on every sandwich that we make automatically. If you ask for it, I'd be happy to get it for you. So that's the stealth part of the menu engineering, that you don't miss the cheese today because you know it's going to be there tomorrow. You don't miss the burger because you know it's going to be there tomorrow or the next day or even tonight. But the idea of menuing, you know, lunch and dinner Monday through Friday, and then dinner Saturday and Sunday, to have the same burger, chicken, grilled cheese sandwich, veggie burger, gets old. So, you know, we try to mix it up. And we do it knowing the data, knowing what impacts this. So the chefs and the operators really take a lot of things into, when they sit down to write a menu, it's not just, do I have to write a menu that has fiscal responsibility to the contract? I have a budget. Is it written to the demographics of the campus? Does it have enough foods for a 60-40 female-male ratio? Is it a high athletic, you know, do I have enough calories on the menu? Because there's a lot of sports teams on campus. There's a lot of psychology that goes into writing menus. When you add this factor into it, this may not be important to the student, but if it's important to the client and the campus, I interject those type of strategies without you guys even knowing it, without you even missing it. And then if it becomes important at the student level, then I kind of pull the doors open, the curtains open, and say, this is why I'm doing this, and this is what the impact is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious why stealth is an important part of menuing.
Well, I heard the question. It's not stealth in purposely. It's the...
Take a look at this room. There's 10,000 undergrads on this campus. So reducing carbon footprint is important to everyone here, and a lot of people that aren't here, but in fact, the majority of students on any campus, no matter how green they say they are, just want to get something to eat before their next class. So I don't want to bury them with information that I'm interested in hearing. We work with sustainability groups on campuses, Real Food Challenge groups, we work with them as well. We make everything clear and transparent, but I don't need to have the flat screens blaring at people who really just want to get to class about what I did to reduce the carbon footprint today. It's important, but it's certainly not a priority to the majority of people. That's a fact.
Any more questions?
I'm just going to go back on the waste tangent aspect for a bit. So I actually work with the Agency of Natural Resources in the Solid Waste Program. And in 2013, we did a statewide waste composition study. And there is over 60,000 tons of food waste that's being landfilled in the state of Vermont this year. I should say in 2013, but estimated on an annual basis. Nationally, US EPA estimates that over 32 million tons are wasted daily. And if you break that down to the average weight of a person, that's 1.5 times the population of the US. So I definitely want to make sure that the waste aspect stays part of the conversation, and that when it goes into the landfill, that is one of the highest anthropogenic sources of methane production. So that's why I brought it up in my previous comment. And that taking it out and managing it through composting or anaerobic digestion definitely plays a factor into the greenhouse gas production. So while it may not affect the production side of it and the distribution packaging side of it, the footprint still plays a big role. So also to draw your attention, if you're interested in the subject of how these food wastes can be managed more mindfully, there is a Vermont Organics Recycling Summit on April 3rd at Vermont Technical College. I encourage you to look into it and see if you can attend.
So I didn't necessarily hear a question in that
Yeah,
one.
was there a
Yeah, so to build on that points, and my apologies if earlier exchanges, if it came across that the waste portion of it, the plate to cradle, was unimportant. Not the case. Exactly because of just that sheer volume that we're talking about of food waste. There's also food loss, but that's a whole other topic. That's in and of itself a very huge problem that the food service industry is definitely tackling. From the greenhouse gas, the climate impact perspective, again, what clients were initially asking for just to get something to market, so like, hey, here's something that we can start talking about to get folks around the table. It didn't make version 1.0. It's still very much something that are like, all right, this needs to be factored in. We need to be building this in here. So it was just a feature sequencing and software project management portion. As far as what can we be doing about that, right? What are some of those trade-offs? What are some of the things that operators think about? Curious, folks in the audience, how many people like coffee? Okay, cool. How many of you yourself or know a friend who really likes those like double XL large, like here's my coffee for the day, right? You've seen the people who go around like they have the really large, like Dunkin' Donuts style or 7-Eleven style types of coffee mugs, right? Thinking about also how many people, if you buy hot coffee, how many of you like your coffee once it's gone cold? And how many times do you see somebody just kind of pour it out and go in and grab their next thing of coffee? For context on that, thinking about the production, the transportation, and everything else that goes into that, you've got coffee that was produced, grown on one continent, shipped to another continent to be processed and made into coffee, and then shipped then to a third continent to be consumed. And if we're throwing out so much of it every single time we just get one, there's a lot to that waste portion, right? Some of the examples that we looked at was that, if there's about 40% of our food goes just wasted, that's basically for every plate that you get, we're actually taking another full plate and just kind of throwing it out, right? For one way or another. So there's a lot of menuing decisions that go into that. How can you lessen the amount that's getting thrown out? How do you engage suppliers to do that? And so that's very much a part of the conversation. It's usually more from, hey, this waste is a measure of inefficiency, right? And so it's usually tackled more from that waste perspective that we were talking about, how much is being wasted and sent to landfill, versus I care about the climate impact of waste. So it's kind of a priority that we had to focus on. So yeah, don't walk away thinking that waste is not important.
Any other questions?
I guess I'm curious for the various categories of things that you track with the Foodprint tool, like which ones are most salient for food service operators, or which ones really stand out as like having potential for like reaping carbon benefits?
So,
or easy for them to implement, or something
like
that.
what's the low-hanging fruit?
What are you finding that the low-hanging fruit is?
And this is something that's generally fairly common knowledge across the industry for food service. That just a lot of it is really around beef, it's around cheese, it's around equipment, right? So those generally are, you're not going to find too many folks in food service and food service industry who are talking about other really low-hanging fruit, how they're approaching it, how they're tackling it, how they're tracking it. You'll start seeing differences there, but pretty much most folks that I've seen and most studies that I've seen are consistently pointing to the really easy stuff is what are we doing in the way that we menu beef, what are we doing in the way that we menu cheese. Kevin gave great examples of those. And then, additional above and beyond that, what are we doing with our equipment, right? How are we using that in a way that's efficient, that isn't wasteful? Did that answer the question for you? All right.
So I have a question, which relates to, it sounds like this tool is tracking pretty comprehensively. You mentioned the infrastructure, the equipment, the products themselves, what it has the ability to incorporate the waste pieces, and that you can tailor it to meet the needs of whichever campus you're working with. You also alluded to the fact that you haven't been able to do life cycle analyses for all the products yet, and so I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about, what percentage, how you prioritize which products to track first and to measure up first, and also what you see as sort of like the next steps, like what's the cutting edge for where you see this tool or your next project going to take it beyond what it's able to do right now.
Sure. Some of those are surprises, so I can't really, it's like, hey, here's your Christmas present a little bit early, so I can't take the packaging off that too much. But I'll see what I can share on that front. As far as the why, the rationale between the 80-20 rule, right? Just general good case practice in, we don't want to boil the ocean, right? We just need something that's gets us good managerial insights that are actionable, that help us say, okay, what are we looking at? And really, what does that mean for the vast majority of it, right? We don't need all the crazy outliers, but we need the big bulk. We need to understand where is that bell curve, right? And so when we're looking at what we spend on a monthly basis, what were the main items that just kept coming up consistently again and again and again, and focusing on those main key hitters, and started there. And incrementally going forward, we're going to keep adding additional SKU items, additional product line items to that. Say, all right, this is what we started with, and let's keep making it more relevant to more cafes. We started with what is the most relevant to most cafes, and then adding in additional stuff above and beyond that. Some additional pieces in there that talk about software releases that haven't been fully released yet. That's a big surprise, right? You don't want to let that cat out of the bag too quick. So things that we are looking at for next iterations are just kind of continually down that line to say, okay, well, what consistently is most important to our clients? Take universities, for example, what's most important to the university clients? What are they consistently asking for, and what can we deliver in that regard that is something that we can do nationally while also making sure that it is locally tailored. Let's see more on that.
Great, thanks. So I think we might have time for one more question. Does anyone have any remaining burning questions for our speaker? All right, well, thank you again, Chris. Were there any final thoughts you'd like to share before we?
One, just excited to see this many people in the room. This is definitely a topic that has been growing over the years, so I'm very excited that University of Vermont is tackling this issue in the way that you have with the Clean Energy Fund and now the speaker series. So I'd encourage you all to keep coming at it, to keep asking the tough questions. This is definitely a fantastic approach, so kudos, thumbs up, high fives.